Elias Thorne pushed through the knee-deep snow, following the familiar path of his morning trapline. He sought the small, certain signs of the wilderness, a vital part of his solitary rhythm in the mountain valley. This morning, however, the crisp, unturned snow offered a different story. Beside the usual deer and rabbit tracks, a smaller, oddly formed print appeared, too neat for any known creature of these parts. An unknown presence had entered his secluded world, threatening the peace he had so carefully built after years of loss. Elias followed the strange trail, his senses sharpened by years of mountain solitude. The tracks led him deeper into a thicket of frosted pines, a place usually undisturbed by anything but the wind. He moved with a quiet caution, his rifle held loosely but ready. The scent of wood smoke, faint and unfamiliar, soon reached him, a smell that did not belong in this part of the high country. Elias Thorne knew every flicker of light and shadow in his territory, and this was an intrusion. He parted a curtain of low-hanging branches and found a desperate camp. A small, smoldering fire struggled against the cold, its embers barely visible. Huddled beneath a tattered blanket, a young woman shivered, her eyes wide with terror as she saw him. She was Elara, and she looked barely older than a girl, her face pale, her lips cracked from exposure. One leg lay at an odd angle beneath her, clearly injured. She tried to scramble away, whimpering a plea for him to leave her alone, her voice thin and ragged like the winter wind. Elias saw the desperation in her eyes and the raw fear that made her tremble, a fear that spoke of more than just the cold. He recognized the look of someone hunted, and he knew a man alone in the wilderness faced a choice between turning away or stepping into a story that was not his own. Twilight began to deepen, painting the snow in shades of violet and gray. Elias lowered his rifle, making his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle Elara further. He knelt a respectful distance away, his gaze calm and steady. He pulled out a small piece of dried venison and a tin cup, offering them without a word. Elara watched him, her breath shallow, her eyes darting between him and the scant protection of the thicket. Her initial fear slowly receded into weary acceptance, replaced by a deep hunger. She reached for the meat with a trembling hand, chewing slowly, as if unsure it was real. Elias then took out his small kettle, melted some snow over the dying embers, and offered her warm water, watching her drink deeply. He examined her leg, noting a deep gash near the ankle, crudely bound with strips of torn cloth. He silently cleaned the wound with snow and then carefully rewrapped it with fresh strips from his own pack, his touch surprisingly gentle. The quiet cold of the wilderness settled around them, no longer an enemy, but a vast silent witness. They sat in an unexpected truce, two strangers bound by the simple act of survival, the unspoken understanding growing between them in the deepening night. The decision was made without words. Elara could not remain in the makeshift camp, nor could she make her own way through the treacherous terrain. Elias Thorne helped her to her feet, supporting her weight against his strong frame. He guided her through the deepening snow, his lantern casting a dim, dancing light on their path. Every step for Elara was a struggle, a gasp of effort against the gnawing cold and the pain in her leg. Yet she pushed forward, an unknown urgency fueling her, a silent resolve etched on her face. The journey was slow, arduous, and long. Elias moved with the steady, unyielding pace of a man who knew every rock and root, every dip and rise of the mountain trails, even in the dark. He watched Elara, seeing her strength waver, then return, a testament to a spirit that refused to break. The dark forest pressed in on them, a vast, silent presence that tested both their limits. Elias felt the familiar burden of responsibility settle on his shoulders once more, a weight he thought he had left behind in his solitary life. He wondered what kind of trouble had driven this young woman so far into the unforgiving mountains, and what new challenges her presence would bring to his carefully constructed peace. The world often offered new paths when one least expected them. He realized then that his solitary life was no longer truly his own. Late into the night, the warm glow of Elias Thorne's cabin appeared through the trees like a promise. Its single window, a beacon in the vast wilderness, guided them home. Relief washed over Elara's face, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Elias helped her through the sturdy wooden door, the interior immediately embracing them, with the smell of pine and old wood smoke. He quickly stoked the embers in the stone fireplace, coaxing a roaring fire that soon filled the small space with light and warmth. Elara took in the simple, sturdy interior, a stark contrast to the makeshift camp and the unforgiving wilderness she had endured. A rough-hewn table stood in the center, surrounded by two chairs. Shelves lined one wall, holding neatly stacked supplies. The bed was a simple bunk built into the wall, covered with thick furs. Elias prepared a warm stew, its savory aroma filling the cabin, a comfort Elara had likely not known for weeks. He offered her the bunk, and she sank onto it, pulling the furs close. They settled into an uneasy, shared silence, the quiet broken only by the crackling fire and the gentle sigh of the wind outside. Elias knew his life had changed the moment he found her tracks in the snow. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the cabin window, painting golden stripes across the log walls. Elias Thorne resumed his daily chores with a quiet efficiency, splitting firewood, mending a section of fence near the small barn, and checking the snare line closer to the homestead. He observed Elara from a distance, noting her slow, careful movements as she began to stir. Her fear had receded, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Elara slowly started to help with small tasks, her movements still hesitant, but improving with each passing hour. She brought in more firewood, swept the cabin floor with a broom made of dried branches, and helped prepare a simple meal. A tentative rhythm developed between them, marked by unspoken communication and a mutual respect for space. Elias would offer a quiet instruction, and Elara would follow, her keen eyes learning the ways of his mountain home. The sounds of their work, the rhythmic chop of an axe, the rustle of leaves being swept, the quiet hiss of a simmering pot, filled the air with a newfound sense of purpose. This was a quiet space, and a careful heart chose patience over fear. Their days unfolded with a quiet grace, a fragile comfort settling into the solitude Elias had once known alone. After several days of settling into this new routine, Elias Thorne ventured further afield to check his more distant trap lines. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, brilliant blue, but an underlying unease settled in his gut. He had a feeling, a whisper on the wind, that something was amiss. His intuition, honed by years of wilderness living, rarely proved wrong. He followed a familiar game trail, passing the ancient cedar where he often left messages for a rare passing trapper. There he saw it, a fresh cut on a young sapling, not made by an animal, but by a saw, a deliberate territorial marker. Further along, one of his snares had been cut, the trap wire severed with a clean, sharp blade. Elias examined the evidence, his expression grim. These were not the signs of a passing hunter or an innocent wanderer. These were the marks of trespass, a deliberate challenge to his solitude and his claim on this land. A distinct, unsettling feeling settled over him, confirming his initial apprehension. His fragile peace was threatened by more than just nature's harsh hand. He knew then that the wilderness held dangers beyond the wild beasts, dangers that walked on two legs. This quiet understanding solidified his resolve, and he turned back towards the cabin, the threat now tangible. The early morning air snapped with a clean cold as Elias Thorne stepped from his cabin. Sunlight, sharp and clear, cut through the frosted trees, painting the snow with long, blue shadows. He carried his axe, its weight familiar in his hand, and began to split firewood, a rhythmic task that settled his thoughts. Elara emerged soon after, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her breath misting in the air. Elias motioned toward a patch of dark, spindly branches near the frozen creek. He explained how those particular twigs, once stripped of their outer bark, could be chewed for a bitter but vital nourishment when winter gripped too tight. He showed her the fine, almost invisible tracks of a snowshoe hare, detailing how its broad feet kept it atop the deep powder. Elara knelt, her fingers brushing the delicate imprints in the snow, absorbing each lesson with a quiet intensity that surprised Elias Thorne. She asked how to tell if a berry was safe, her voice soft but curious, and Elias pointed out a dried cluster of mountain cranberries, still clinging to a low bush. He demonstrated how to test the wind for shifts in weather, explaining that a sudden calm often preceded a storm. She watched his every movement, her gaze steady and focused. learning not just the facts but the rhythm of the wilderness itself. Elias found himself speaking more than he usually did, his words softened by the clear understanding in her eyes. The vast, silent beauty of the winter landscape seemed to cradle their shared activity. It was a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. Later that evening, inside the cabin, the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the log walls. Elias cleaned his rifle, the oiled metal gleaming in the dim light. Elara sat across from him, mending a tear in one of Elias's worn canvas bags, her needle flashing with careful precision. The quiet hum of the fire filled the space, a comforting sound against the vast silence outside. Elara spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper, hesitant at first. She mentioned a time before, a place where people lived differently. There was trouble, she said, a word heavy with unspoken meaning. She described the way some men could make a world feel small, even when surrounded by wide-open spaces. She did not name names, nor did she speak of specific events, but Elias understood the fear woven into her words. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the thread through the canvas. She spoke of needing to flee, to find a place where eyes did not watch every move, where choices were her own. Elias listened, his gaze steady on her. He saw the deep-seated apprehension in her eyes, a shadow clinging to her young face. His own past held its share of unwelcome shadows, and he recognized the language of escape. He offered no judgment, only a silent, steady presence. He knew some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. The next morning, as Elias Thorne split logs near the edge of his clearing, a distant sound carried on the crisp air. It was the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats, too steady for a wild animal, too purposeful for a stray rider. He paused, axe held mid-swing, his eyes scanning the tree line. Elara, inside the cabin, was arranging dried herbs, but Elias knew she heard it too. A lone rider emerged from the dense pines, a man on a bay horse, his silhouette stark against the white snow. His name was Silas Vance. Vance was a man known more for his avarice than his honesty, a fur trapper and land speculator whose shadow had lately stretched too far across the territory. Vance rode directly to the clearing, stopping a respectful distance from Elias, but his eyes were anything but respectful. They were hard, assessing, missing nothing. Vance dismounted slowly, his hand lingering near the pistol on his hip. He offered a curt greeting, his voice rough, and spoke of checking his own traps, a claim Elias knew to be false. Then his gaze swept pointedly towards the cabin. He asked Elias if he had seen any new faces recently, any strays or lost travelers passing through this secluded valley. His question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. Elias met his gaze, his own expression unyielding. He replied that he had seen no one, that his patch of wilderness remained as solitary as ever. Vance's thin smile did not reach his eyes. He said some folks believed this valley held more than just quiet beauty. Inside, Elara, hidden behind a crack in the cabin wall, recognized the familiar brand of danger in Vance's predatory stare. The old fear, the one she thought she had outrun, stirred cold in her heart. Elias knew then that the danger Elara had fled had found its scent, closing the distance between his solitary life and her desperate past. The wild was vast, but some men made its corners feel small and dangerous. After Silas Vance departed, his hoofbeats fading into the forest silence, Elias Thorne moved with a new urgency. He walked the perimeter of his cabin, examining every approach, his mind already formulating a defense. Elara watched him from the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Elias began to reinforce the cabin's weak points, securing window shutters with heavier bolts and bracing the door with a thick log. He showed Elara how to set tripwires around the clearing, simple snares that would alert them to an intruder without causing serious harm. Elara, though shaken by Vance's presence, moved with surprising purpose. She quickly learned the precise placement of each wire, her small hands nimble as she worked. Elias pointed out areas where sightlines could be improved, where a fallen tree could provide cover, or a dense thicket could offer concealment. They worked in a focused, unspoken partnership, their movements synchronized by a shared understanding of the looming threat. Each hammered nail, each carefully placed branch, was a testament to their combined determination. They were preparing for a potential return, transforming their simple sanctuary into a fortress against unseen eyes. As dusk settled, bringing with it the deep cold of the mountains, Elias and Elara sat by the fire, the cabin warm and secure around them. Elias had been carving a small piece of pine earlier, a half-finished bird taking flight. He had set it aside when Vance's arrival had demanded his full attention. Elara's gaze fell upon the small wooden creature. She quietly picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth lines. With Elias's unspoken permission, she took up his carving knife, her movements hesitant at first, then growing more confident. She began to add delicate details to the bird's wings, refining the shape of its beak, giving it a life Elias had not quite captured. The act brought a quiet sense of peace to her features, a calm focus that smoothed the lines of worry from her brow. It was a small, comforting task, a tangible claim on this new space, this cabin that had become her temporary home. Elias watched her, a subtle shift occurring within him. He saw not just a refugee, but a creator, a soul finding solace in shaping wood, adding her own touch to his solitary world. Later that night, long after Elara had fallen asleep, Elias Thorne stood outside the cabin, leaning against the rough-hewn timbers of the woodshed. The stars blazed with fierce intensity in the clear, cold sky, a silent, infinite canvas. He contemplated the vastness above, then the sudden, stark shift in his solitary life. Elara's presence, while bringing an unexpected warmth, also brought a heightened danger. Vance's probing questions, the menace in his eyes confirmed that the outside world, with its cruelty and greed, was now at his doorstep. Elias acknowledged the cost. His quiet existence, once a refuge from his own profound grief, was irrevocably changed. Yet a different kind of feeling stirred within him, an unexpected flicker of purpose. Protecting Elara was not just a burden, but a choice, a path he had unconsciously walked into. Despite his ingrained isolation, the deep-seated habit of keeping to himself, he silently reaffirmed his commitment to her safety. He understood that this decision carried an immense weight, a responsibility that echoed the one he had failed to uphold in his past. But this time, he would not falter. The cabin slept in the deep quiet of the mountain night. Elias Thorne, ever vigilant, lay awake, listening to the subtle sounds of the wilderness. A sudden guttural snarl ripped through the stillness, followed by a heavy thud that shook the cabin walls. Elias was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. Elara bolted upright in her bunk, her eyes wide with alarm. Elias moved quickly to secure the door, sliding the heavy bar into place, his movements swift and practiced. Elara, her fear palpable but controlled, reached for the lantern, her hands steady as she lit the wick. Through a narrow crack in the window shutter, Elias peered out. In the dim light, he saw a massive, shaggy shape, a grizzly bear, its powerful shoulder slamming against the logs. It sniffed furiously at the cabin seams, drawn by the lingering scent of their cooking, its growls vibrating through the wooden walls. Its eyes glinted with aggression, reflecting the lantern light. Elias whispered a sharp command to Elara to stay low, his voice tight with urgency. The bear was attempting to breach the cabin, its primal hunger a formidable adversary. This was not the insidious threat of men, but the raw, immediate danger of the wild itself, testing their alertness and forcing them to confront nature's brute force once more. The sound of its claws scraping against the wood was a chilling reminder of the thin barrier between life and the deep, hungry dark. The bear, frustrated by the sturdy logs and the growing light, eventually lumbered away, its heavy steps fading into the snow-muffled forest. Inside, Elias and Elara sat in the quiet cabin, the adrenaline slowly receding from their bodies. The air was thick with the lingering scent of wood smoke and the quiet aftermath of fear. Elara leaned against the wall, her breathing shallow at first, then deepening into a calmer rhythm. Elias reloaded his rifle, his movements deliberate, then set it against the wall, a silent symbol of their defense. A shared glance passed between them, a profound, unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual survival. They had faced the immediate danger together, their reliance on each other clear and essential. The fear of the bear now past left behind a quiet sense of solidarity, a warmth that settled deep in the chilled cabin air. Elara offered a tired but grateful smile. Elias returned it with a slight nod, a silent promise of continued protection. The night still held its secrets, and the human threat from Vance still loomed somewhere beyond the tree line. But for this moment, they simply breathed side by side, their bond deepened by the shared ordeal. Elias Thorne spotted the trespassers before they reached his boundary markers. Silas Vance, identifiable by his broad, swaggering frame, led two of his men, their axes gleaming in the mid-morning sun. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. His immediate goal was to assess Vance's intentions without revealing Elara's presence. The obstacle was Vance's brazen disregard for his land, and the stakes were the safety of his home and the fragile peace he had found. Elias watched from a thicket of snow-laden pines, his rifle held loosely in his hands. The men moved with a deliberate slowness, already felling several young firs just inside Elias's marked territory. Each swing of an axe echoed like a challenge through the crisp air. Elias knew this was no accidental straying. This was a direct provocation. He moved from his hidden spot, stepping into the open clearing, his presence startling the men. Vance turned, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He held a hand up to his men, who stopped their chopping, leaning on their axes. Vance's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Elias, then lingered on the cabin in the distance. He spoke of needing timber, of land that lay unused, words laced with a menace as thin as the mountain air. Elias stood firm, his voice steady. He stated his claim plainly, reminded Vance of the marked lines. He understood Vance's words to be a thinly veiled threat about land claims and an accusation of squatting. Elara, from her hidden vantage point inside the cabin, peered through a narrow crack in the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Vance's sneering face, the way his heavy boots trod over ground Elias had worked so hard to keep clear. She recognized the dangerous pattern of intimidation, the cruel glee in his eyes, a sight too familiar from her past. The glint of their axes, the defiant posture of Vance, all spoke of a coming storm. The chopped trees lay like fallen sentinels, a clear message of disregard. Elias walked back to the cabin, the tension from Vance's visit still clinging to him like a burr. Inside, Elara waited, her face pale but her eyes sharp with understanding. Elias laid out the situation on the rough-hewn table, tracing lines on a crude map of his land with a calloused finger. He explained the options as he saw them. They could fight, they could flee deeper into the wilderness, or he could try to reason with Vance, though he knew that last choice was likely futile. Elara listened, her hands clasped tightly, then surprised Elias with her unyielding resolve. She spoke quietly, but with a fierce conviction. Retreating had never solved anything in her experience, she said. Bullies, she explained, only grew bolder when met with surrender. Her past had taught her that. Elias watched her, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. He had expected fear, perhaps a plea for escape. Instead, he found a partner ready to stand firm. They spoke for a long time, the afternoon light fading around them. Elias had always faced his challenges alone, but now a shared mind brought new angles to consider. They decided to stand their ground, but with a plan that avoided a direct, open conflict if possible. They would make it clear this land was defended, without spilling blood unless absolutely forced. The worn compass, usually in Elias's pocket, lay on the table between them, a silent arbiter of their serious discussion. As twilight deepened into a moonless night, a different kind of work began. Elias and Elara moved with silent purpose around the cabin, their actions becoming increasingly coordinated. Elias had always worked alone, but Elara understood the need for quiet efficiency. They set up subtle warnings, tripwires of thin cords strung low across likely approaches, tied to small bells that would barely whisper but would be heard by their attuned ears. They also planned diversions. Piles of dry leaves and kindling were placed strategically, ready to be ignited quickly to create smoke screens or false trails. Elias showed Elara how to move through the thick underbrush without snapping a twig, how to melt into the shadows. He demonstrated defensive positions, and she mirrored his movements with a quickness that spoke of past necessity. The air inside the cabin was thick with anticipation, but a quiet confidence settled between them. Elias found himself relying on Elara's keen eyesight and quick thinking more than he would have imagined. Their shared purpose, the silent collaboration, was forging a bond stronger than words could express. They would be ready when Vance returned. The next morning, deep in the woods, Elias instructed Elara on setting a sophisticated, non-lethal trap. He wanted something that would deter intruders, perhaps hold them momentarily without causing serious injury. It was a complex arrangement of intertwined ropes, carefully placed branches, and a weighted log designed to swing down and block a path, not crush a man. This required precision and perfect coordination. Elias explained the mechanics, demonstrating each step slowly. Elara followed his lead perfectly, her fingers nimble as she manipulated the knots, anticipating his needs before he even gestured. She had a natural aptitude for the wilderness, a quick grasp of its hidden language. Elias felt a quiet satisfaction as the trap took shape, a testament to their growing partnership. The successful completion of the task, a quiet victory, solidified their bond. It was a small, practical triumph in the face of larger, looming threats. Elias nodded, a rare, approving smile touching his lips. He saw not just a survivor, but a capable partner. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. Later that afternoon, Elias Thorne sat alone on a quiet ridge overlooking the vast, snow-dusted valley. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to his lost family, the wife and daughter taken by the harsh frontier years ago. He remembered the deep loneliness that had consumed him, a pervasive chill that had settled into his bones, shaping his solitary life. He had built this cabin, not as a home, but as a refuge from the world, a place where grief could live undisturbed. The wind rustled through the pines, a familiar, mournful sound, yet today it felt different. Elara's presence, though quiet and often unspoken, had started to chip away at that isolation. Elias realized that protecting her had given him a new purpose, a different kind of connection than he thought possible. He had been so focused on guiding her, on being her shield. He understood now that her unwavering resolve to stand against Vance, to fight against the very kind of cruelty she had fled, was not just for her own survival. Elara carried a quiet fire, a deep desire to prevent others from suffering as she had, a subtle but profound drive that made her a protector in her own right. She was not just seeking refuge, she was actively seeking to prevent the spread of the darkness she had experienced. In protecting her, Elias was finding a path to protect himself from his own lingering ghost. This understanding settled deep within Elias, a truth as clear as the mountain air. The vast wilderness, once a mirror for his solitude, now felt like a canvas for a future he had stopped imagining. The compass, clutched in his hand, felt heavier, imbued with new meaning. Inside the cabin that evening, as Elias worked on mending a harness, Elara prepared for the night. She took out the small pistol Elias had given her for emergencies, a short-barreled weapon he had kept for years, hardly ever used. Despite her youth, Elara meticulously cleaned the mechanism, her movements precise and steady. Elias observed her quiet determination, seeing not just the fear that had once clouded her eyes, but a fierce will to survive, to protect what little peace they had found. She loaded the pistol carefully, placing each round with focused attention. Her jaw was set, her gaze fixed on the task. When she finished, she looked up at Elias, her eyes clear and unwavering. No words were exchanged, but Elias understood. Her look conveyed a silent promise to stand by him, ready for whatever came. It was an unspoken vow of partnership, a courage born of deep resolve that surprised Elias in its intensity. He knew then that she would not break. Deep night fell, casting long shadows across the snow-covered woods near Elias's cabin. A sudden, faint disturbance triggered one of their tripwires, the whisper of a bell barely audible above the wind, yet sharp enough to pierce the silence. Elias and Elara were instantly awake, their senses heightened. Approaching figures, Vance's men. Elias moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the shutter. 3 dark shapes moved cautiously toward the cabin. He whispered a command to Elara. They had rehearsed this. Elara moved to the back wall, igniting a small pile of dry brush and leaves they had prepared earlier. A plume of thick, acrid smoke billowed upwards, catching the wind, while a preset snare sprang, sending a cascade of branches tumbling down a nearby slope. The diversion worked. Vance's men, startled by the noise and the sudden smoke, turned their attention towards the false alarm. Elias and Elara used the confusion to slip out the rear of the cabin, moving swiftly and silently into the dense tree line. They executed their pre-planned retreat, leading Vance's men away from the cabin, deeper into the bewildering maze of the wilderness. The sounds of branches snapping and confused shouts faded behind them as they pressed forward, leaving their sanctuary behind, retreating under pursuit. Elias Thorne led Elara through the deep wilderness, following winding mountain trails as dawn painted the eastern sky with pale light. His gaze constantly swept the rugged, unfamiliar terrain, searching for any sign of pursuit, any broken twig or disturbed rock that might betray Silas Vance's men. He moved with a practiced fluidity, his heavy boots carefully placed to leave minimal trace, and he often paused to brush away their footprints in the softer earth. Elara followed close behind, her breath misting in the cold air, her shoulders hunched against the biting wind. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak upon Elara, a weariness that settled deep in her bones. Each step was a battle against the rising fatigue, but she pushed through, driven by an unyielding will to survive. She trusted Elias Thorne, a quiet faith that had grown in the silent hours they shared. His broad back was a constant, reassuring presence before her, a shield against the vast, indifferent wild. Elias spoke only in quiet directions, his voice low and calm, pointing out a safer foothold or a hidden turn in the path. Elara asked only occasional questions about their path, her voice soft, careful not to break the fragile silence that was their best defense. Elias Thorne understood her need for reassurance, offering a brief nod or a steady glance over his shoulder. He knew that the danger from Vance still lingered, a shadow in their wake, making every rustle of leaves or distant bird call a potential threat. They were a single, moving unit, two figures against the vast, indifferent wilderness, bound by the shared goal of escape. The sunlight dappled through the dense foliage, painting fleeting patterns on the snow. But Elias Thorne saw only the path ahead and the signs of what lay behind. After hours of relentless travel, Elias Thorne and Elara stumbled upon a hidden clearing, a sudden pocket of breathtaking beauty. A frozen waterfall stood majestic against the backdrop of snow-dusted pines, its cascade of ice sparkling like diamonds in the midday sun. The sheer artistry of nature, captured in a moment of frozen stillness, was a profound sight. Elara's weariness momentarily faded, her eyes wide with awe, her lips parting in a soft gasp of wonder. She stared, mesmerized by the intricate patterns of ice, a rare moment of peace washing over her. It was a reprieve from the constant tension, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, beauty could be found. Elias Thorne, too, paused, his hand resting on the smooth wood of his rifle, his gaze softening as he took in the scene. He appreciated the stark, powerful beauty, a silent testament to the wild spirit they were fighting to preserve against the likes of Silas Vance. Elias Thorne watched Elara for a moment, seeing the wonder in her eyes. He knew these moments were precious, fleeting respites in their arduous journey. He quietly observed that the ice on the falls held a deep blue at its core, a color that spoke of immense cold and ancient patience. The tranquility was a balm, a temporary shield against the chill of doubt that often crept into the hearts of those on the run. As twilight deepened into evening, Elias Thorne and Elara huddled together in a small, temporary lean-to, the air growing sharp with cold. The fire they had carefully built offered scant warmth against the encroaching chill. Elara broke the silence, her voice small and laced with fear. She wondered if they could truly escape, if the wilderness was vast enough to hide them forever from Silas Vance. Her fear of the unknown was a tangible weight in the confined space. Elias Thorne listened, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. He understood her doubt, for the wilderness could be a cruel master, and human malice a persistent shadow. He reassured her with quiet confidence, his voice a low rumble. He spoke of enduring one day at a time, of finding strength in the small victories, and of keeping their hearts steady against the fear. He reminded her that their survival so far was proof of their resilience. Their exchange was not a debate, but a quiet sharing of burdens, a moment of profound vulnerability. Elias Thorne saw Elara's fear lessen, not vanish, but transform into a shared determination. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. The vast, dark forest pressed in around them, its silence profound. But the small fire kept the darkness at bay, and their shared breath warmed the space between them. The next morning, as a pale light filtered into their lean-to, Elias Thorne produced a small, iron-bound wooden compass from his pouch. It was simple, carved from a sturdy piece of oak with a rough-hewn needle that always found true north. He showed it to Elara, explaining how he navigated the pathless wilderness, not just by the sun or the stars, but by this small, personal instrument. He spoke of finding one's inner bearing, especially when the outer world felt lost and confusing. Elias Thorne explained that the compass was more than just a tool for direction. It was a reminder to trust one's own sense of right and wrong, to hold steady when storms rage, both outside and within. He had carried it for many years, a constant in his solitary journeys. Elara was fascinated, tracing the iron rim with a delicate finger. She saw the compass not just as a piece of wood and metal, but as a metaphor for resilience, a portable piece of hope that could guide one through any trial. Elias Thorne watched her, a small smile touching his lips as he saw the understanding dawn in her eyes. He knew she grasped the deeper meaning, the quiet philosophy he lived by. He had walked alone with that philosophy for so long, and now sharing it felt like tilling a new, fertile soil. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. Elara's presence was slowly changing the shape of his world. As they continued their journey through a particularly treacherous area, Elias Thorne found himself struggling to find a safe passage. The winding game trail they followed narrowed, disappearing into a dense thicket of thorny brush and loose rock. He consulted his compass, then his instincts, but the way ahead seemed blocked, a frustrating obstacle in their flight. His brow furrowed with concentration, scanning for any subtle sign of a navigable route. Elara, walking quietly behind him, suddenly stopped. She pointed a gloved finger towards a barely visible gap in the undergrowth, where a few bent saplings suggested a path less used, a deer trail almost entirely overgrown. Her eyes, sharper than he had given her credit for, had noticed the subtle signs of nature that Elias Thorne had momentarily overlooked. She had found a route that offered a better, safer passage. Elias Thorne, initially surprised, acknowledged her keen eye with a nod of approval. It was a small but significant moment. Elara was no longer merely following, but actively contributing to their survival, her role evolving from dependent to partner. Her resourcefulness was a welcome addition to his own years of experience. This hidden path, discovered by Elara's quiet observation, was a sudden shift, a testament to her growing strength. It meant their journey might be easier than he had anticipated, but it also placed new weight upon her shoulders, a choice she had unknowingly made. They followed Elara's trail for a time, finding it indeed less difficult, and eventually discovered a small, dry cave, offering a welcome respite from the elements. Elias Thorne quickly lit a small fire at the mouth of the cave, the flames chasing away the damp chill and casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. They settled in, savoring the brief period of comfort, a fragile peace in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. As they rested, sharing a meager portion of dried meat, a distant, faint echo of a gunshot disturbed the quiet. It was a single, sharp crack that resonated through the still air, shattering their temporary tranquility. Elias Thorne and Elara exchanged a look of renewed apprehension, their faces tightening. The sound, though far off, was a stark reminder that Silas Vance's reach extended far into these mountains. The cozy cave interior suddenly felt less safe, the flickering fire offering little protection against the unseen threat. Elias Thorne knew that the sound could be a hunter, or worse, Vance's men, perhaps signaling their own position or simply testing the silence. The brief calm had been a false one, a fleeting illusion. Their fragile peace was gone, replaced by the chilling awareness that the pursuit continued, relentless and unseen. As night truly fell, Elias Thorne sat by the dwindling fire in the cave, staring at his wooden compass. He held it in his calloused palm, its familiar weight a comfort, but his thoughts had drifted far beyond mere physical direction. He realized it no longer just pointed north, a cold, indifferent guide across the vast expanse. It had begun to point inward, towards a deeper truth. The compass now reminded him of his purpose, a quiet, unwavering resolve to protect Elara, to guide her to safety. It was a moral bearing, a steady hand against the chaotic winds of their flight. The compass, once a symbol of his solitary path, of his lone wanderings and self-imposed exile, now represented something entirely new. It had become a symbol of a shared journey, a promise whispered to the silent wilderness. Elias Thorne understood that the compass in his hand reflected a compass within his heart, one that pointed towards connection, towards responsibility, towards a future he had never dared to imagine. It was no longer just about survival, but about leading someone home, a path he had almost forgotten how to walk. His solitary spirit was slowly, irrevocably changing. After hours more of travel, pushing through the encroaching darkness, Elias Thorne led Elara to an old abandoned trapper's cabin. It was dilapidated, its roof sagging and a window shattered, but its sturdy log walls offered far more protection than any lean-to or cave. A small measure of relief washed over them as Elias pushed open the creaking door, the smell of damp earth and old wood greeting them. They quickly worked to secure it, Elias Thorne boarding up the broken window with a plank he found nearby, while Elara swept out the dust and debris. A fire was soon roaring in the stone hearth, its warmth a welcome embrace after the long, cold journey. They were exhausted, their muscles aching, but a cautious hope flickered in their eyes. This forgotten cabin, though temporary, felt like a small fortress, a new base camp in the heart of the wild. They settled in, sharing a quiet meal, the silence broken only by the crackling fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Elias Thorne knew this shelter was still vulnerable, a known landmark to those who truly understood these mountains. But for now, it was a haven, a place to regroup and recover. The next day would bring new challenges and perhaps with it, deeper revelations about the paths they had each walked before finding each other. The morning light filtered into the trapper's cabin, soft and forgiving after the hard journey. Elias Thorne watched Elara move about, her steps surer, the shadow of exhaustion lifting from her face. A night of undisturbed rest had done her good, loosening the tight coil of fear that had held her. She stoked the fire, her movements gentle, and then sat on a rough-hewn stool looking at the flames. Elias sensed a shift in her, a quiet readiness to speak. He continued sharpening his knife, the rasping sound filling the silence, a signal of his patient presence. She began to speak then, her voice low, almost a whisper against the crackle of the fire. She spoke of a life far from these mountains, a life of constant pressure and petty tyrannies. It was a life where choices were made for her, where she was kept small and afraid, controlled by a man whose name she did not yet utter, but whose shadow was long. Elias understood that shadow. She described a place where kindness was rare, and power was used to crush, not to uplift. She had seen good people suffer, and she had learned to make herself invisible. Her words painted a picture of a gilded cage, beautiful on the outside, but suffocating within. Elias listened with a heavy heart, the details echoing a familiar pattern of human cruelty. He saw the depth of her trauma, the evil she had escaped, and the fragile courage it had taken to run. The fire offered a quiet comfort, its warmth filling the small cabin, making the dark tales a little less sharp. Elias understood this quiet telling was a sacred trust, a vulnerable offering. Later that morning, Elias Thorne worked outside the trapper's cabin, splitting logs. The bite of the axe into wood was a steady rhythm, a familiar comfort. Elara's story echoed in his mind, stirring old, settled grief. He thought of his own family, lost to a swift illness that swept through the frontier like a cruel wind, leaving him with an emptiness that had never truly healed. The circumstances of their losses were different, a sudden illness for his own, a slow oppression for hers. Yet the core of the emptiness they carried felt profoundly similar. Elias saw how Elara had been stripped of her agency, her spirit almost broken by the relentless pressure. He had felt a different kind of breaking, the sudden tear of absence, the silence after a lifetime of laughter. Both knew what it meant to have a future stolen, to walk through a world that felt suddenly barren. Elias realized that protecting Elara had become more than just a duty. It was a way to mend something broken within himself. It was a chance to give someone else the peace and freedom he had almost given up on for his own life. This shared experience solidified his resolve to ensure Elara found peace in a future, a path he had once thought closed to himself. A few miles from the trapper's cabin, Elias Thorne and Elara found a small, desolate clearing in the late afternoon. They had been foraging for late-season berries and useful roots. The air grew heavy with an unsettling scent, a mix of old smoke and something metallic. They soon came upon a makeshift camp, recently abandoned, strewn with evidence that turned Elias's stomach. Crude traps, carelessly discarded, lay among the trampled snow. The ground was littered with the refuse of careless men. They found a brutally mangled animal, a small fox, left to suffer and die in a rusty snare, its fur ruined, its life wasted. There were signs of reckless disregard for the land, half-eaten scraps tossed into the snow, a smoldering fire pit, and the distinct, unmistakable tracks of too many men. The discovery confirmed Silas Vance's cruelty, not just towards people, but towards the very wilderness Elias cherished. Elias felt a cold, hard knot of determination tighten in his gut. Elara beside him drew a sharp breath, her fear reigniting. But beneath it, Elias saw a flicker of righteous anger in her eyes. The knowledge that such men walked his mountains, leaving such devastation, made the fight personal. Elias knew then that he would not simply protect Elara from Vance, he would protect the land itself from such wanton destruction. Returning to the trapper's cabin as dusk settled, Elias Thorne felt a profound shift within him. The sight of Vance's cruelty in the clearing, the mangled fox, the desecrated land, ignited a fire he had not felt in years. His protective instinct for Elara, which had been a quiet, personal commitment, transformed into a broader conviction. He realized that protecting her was part of a larger fight, a stand against the destructive forces that threatened not just individual lives, but the very values of respect and compassion that held the wilderness in balance. Elias walked with a firmer stride, his hand instinctively touching the wooden compass at his belt. His solitude, once a retreat from pain, began to transform into a quiet form of guardianship. He was no longer just a solitary mountain man, but a silent sentinel for a fragile peace, a new way of belonging to this vast, wild world. Elara's unexpected contribution to their survival would be needed soon. A few days later, in the crisp morning air, Elias Thorne and Elara were in the woods near their cabin. Elias worked to set a new snare, mindful of the recent signs of trespassers. The forest was quiet, but Elias always listened. Then a distant snap of a twig, too heavy for a deer, too regular for a wandering wolf. It came again, closer this time, followed by a muffled murmur of voices. It sounded like more than one man, potentially Vance's men. Elara's eyes, sharp with observation, immediately scanned the ground. She quickly gathered a pile of dry leaves and brush, her movements swift and purposeful. With a practiced hand, she ignited it, creating a thick smoke screen that billowed up through the trees. Then she dragged a fallen branch behind her, scuffing the snow to create a convincing false trail leading away from their true position. Elias watched, surprised by her quick thinking and her decisive action. The diversion worked, sending their pursuers in the wrong direction, their shouts of confusion fading into the distance. Elara, once a frightened refugee, had become a resourceful and quick-witted partner, her cleverness a vital tool in their survival. She had proven her keen mind could navigate more than just pass. This was a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. Her unexpected ingenuity offered a new layer of protection, shifting their defensive strategy from evasion to active misdirection. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. That evening, inside the trapper's cabin, the air grew serious. Elias Thorne knew their current shelter, though sturdy, was too close to their original home, and now too well known to Vance. He acknowledged that the trapper's cabin was merely temporary, a vulnerable respite. They sat across from each other, a crude map spread between them on the small table. Elias spoke of their options, the need to find a more permanent solution, a new home. They discussed the possibility of moving further into the untouched mountains, perhaps even seeking a small, distant settlement if one could be found that offered true safety. The conversation was serious, contemplating a future together that required greater risk and faith than either had considered possible just weeks ago. Elara listened intently, tracing lines on the map with a thoughtful finger, her gaze distant as she envisioned a life beyond constant flight. The weight of the decision settled between them, a silent commitment to a shared horizon. Over the next few days, Elias Thorne and Elara worked tirelessly to fortify their current cabin. They knew they must stay for a while longer, enough time to assess their options and prepare for the deeper journey ahead. The cabin, once a simple shelter, began to transform under their hands. Elias reinforced window shutters, using thick planks of salvaged wood, his hammer blows echoing through the quiet woods. Elara, equally industrious, helped him create hidden caches beneath the floorboards, carefully storing emergency rations and supplies. They established a clear escape route, clearing brush and marking subtle trails should they need to flee quickly. This shared labor, this silent, coordinated effort, reinforced their bond more powerfully than any words could. Their faces were often smudged with dirt, their muscles aching, but their resolve remained unwavering, a testament to their unwavering commitment to each other's safety. Each nail driven, each board secured, was a promise of their shared future. As night fell on the wilderness surrounding the trapper's cabin, Elias Thorne and Elara rested, but their senses remained sharp. The sounds of the night were usually a familiar symphony, but tonight there were dissonant notes. A distant snap of a twig, too precise, too deliberate for an animal. A muffled cough carried on the cold air, then quickly stifled. Elias's keen senses confirmed his worst fears. Vance's men were out there. They were establishing a perimeter, slowly, inexorably closing in. A silent, grim understanding passed between Elias and Elara. The time for evasion was nearly over. The wilderness had protected them, but now even its vastness felt small. The imminent danger was palpable, a heavy presence in the darkness beyond their reinforced walls. Elias knew the arrival of a new natural threat would soon complicate their desperate situation. Elias Thorne woke to an unnatural stillness, a quiet that spoke of heavy snow. He pushed himself from his bunk, the cabin air sharp with the chill of an early morning. His immediate goal was to check the perimeter, but an ominous darkness already bled into the eastern sky, blotting out the first hint of dawn. A fierce blizzard was the obstacle, a raw, untamed force that threatened to engulf the mountains. If Elias and Elara did not secure their refuge quickly, the storm would prove as deadly as Silas Vance and his men, trapping them in a deadly white prison. Elias moved to the window, scraping frost from the pane with a calloused thumb. Outside, the world was already a blur of white, the trees swaying wildly under the assault of unseen winds. He knew this kind of storm, one that rolled in fast and swallowed everything whole. He called to Elara, his voice low but urgent. She stirred, her eyes wide with apprehension as she saw the rapidly worsening conditions through the small glass. Elias explained the danger, his words clipped, practical. This was not a passing squall. This was winter's full fury, unleashed without warning. The wind began to howl, a mournful, relentless cry that vibrated through the sturdy log walls of the trapper's cabin. Snow lashed against the windows, piling up in drifts that grew thicker by the minute. Escape, which had always been a distant possibility, now vanished under the blinding white curtain. The mountain itself seemed to rise against them, an overwhelming adversary. This new enemy, the blizzard, felt just as menacing as Vance's relentless pursuit, complicated by the biting cold and the immediate threat to their very breath. Elias knew their options were now stark, survival resting solely on their resilience and the strength of their temporary shelter. A frantic energy filled the small cabin as Elias and Elara launched into a desperate race against the intensifying storm. Elias barked short, urgent commands, his mind already calculating the most critical needs. He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed his axe, and plunged outside into the blinding snow. His breath misted instantly, swallowed by the swirling white. His goal was firewood, enough to last them through days of isolation, and the task was brutal. Each trip to the woodpile was a battle against the gale, the drifts already hip-deep, but he pushed through, his arms laden with logs. Inside, Elara moved with surprising efficiency, her actions a silent acknowledgement of the danger. She pulled down stored food from shelves, carefully rationing out portions, a grim understanding in her eyes. The fire in the hearth roared, but the cold seeped in around the ill-fitting door and window frames. She began stuffing rags into every crack, sealing drafts, her fingers nimble despite the chill. She melted snow in a large pot over the fire, ensuring a supply of water, her movements a blur of necessity. They worked in a focused, unspoken partnership, each anticipating the other's needs. Elias returned from his last trip, snow clinging to his beard and eyebrows, his face red from the wind. He slammed the heavy door shut, bolting it with a thick wooden bar, the sound a definitive end to their external efforts. The cabin was a small, fragile boat tossed in a raging white sea. Their combined efforts had secured what they could. But the real test, the long, grinding trial of endurance, was just beginning. They stood for a moment, chests heaving, their breath misting in the cold air, even indoors, listening to the relentless shriek of the blizzard outside. For 2 days, the trapper's cabin became their entire world, a confined space swallowed by the white chaos outside. Snow piled high against the windows, transforming them into frosted, opaque canvases. The wind became a constant roar, a primal sound that vibrated through the very bones of the structure, a relentless, deafening presence. Elias Thorne and Elara moved through their small prison with quiet vigilance, each sound from beyond the walls a potential warning. They spoke in hushed tones, conserving energy. Their world shrunk to the radius of the flickering firelight. Elias watched the snow accumulate, his seasoned eye calculating the depth. He knew the mountains, knew their fury. This storm would keep any man from moving, let alone pursuing another through such a treacherous landscape. He realized then that the blizzard, while a formidable and immediate danger to them, had also become an unexpected ally. It had stalled Vance's pursuit, effectively trapping Silas Vance and his men somewhere nearby, just beyond the reach of the cabin. This knowledge created a strange, tense coexistence, isolated by the storm, yet still vulnerable to the unseen enemy waiting for the skies to clear. The realization settled over Elias like the snow itself, heavy and certain. Vance could not reach them, not now, but neither could they flee. They were in a temporary stalemate, a shared prison with their pursuers. The storm provided a respite from direct confrontation, but it also ensured the threat remained, lurking just out of sight, a patient predator. This forced truce meant they gained time, but also a deeper, more profound waiting. The mountain held them all captive. The next choice would come only when the wind decided to release them. The blizzard raged on, transforming their temporary sanctuary into a severe trial of endurance. The cold seeped into the cabin despite their best efforts, chilling them to the bone. Their breath plumed in the air, a constant reminder of the encroaching frost. Food supplies, carefully rationed, began to run critically low. Elias and Elara ate sparingly, each bite a conscious effort to sustain themselves. The vast, hungry wilderness pressed in on them from all sides, a silent, pervasive adversary. Elara showed signs of fatigue and despair, her youthful resilience worn thin by the relentless cold and the gnawing uncertainty. Her movements grew slower, her eyes often distant, gazing into the flickering flames as if searching for answers in the dance of shadows. Elias, recognizing the psychological toll, encouraged her with quiet strength, sharing stories of past winters he had faced alone. He spoke of the mountain's moods, the predictable end to even the fiercest storms, weaving a narrative of endurance and hope that seemed to warm her more than the meager fire. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. Their mental fortitude was tested as much as their physical endurance. They relied solely on each other for hope, for warmth, for the quiet reassurance that they were not entirely alone in this desolate, frozen world. Elias found himself drawing on reserves he thought long depleted, memories of a past loss that had almost broken him. But Elara's presence, her quiet determination, fueled a new kind of resolve within him. They were two against the elements, two against a human foe, but together they found a strength that neither possessed alone. Elias knew they had to hold on, if not for themselves, then for each other. As the blizzard raged into its deep night, a moment of profound despair descended upon Elara. Shivering despite the layers of blankets Elias had wrapped around her, she turned to him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. She confided in Elias her deepest fears, a confession of utter vulnerability. She spoke of the hopelessness she had felt before meeting him, the constant gnawing dread of her past catching her. She spoke of the loneliness that had been her constant companion, a stark, raw truth. Elias listened, his gaze steady and empathetic. For the first time, he openly shared a fragment of his own grief, speaking of the loss of his family to the harshness of the frontier. He did not offer platitudes, but the quiet, raw truth of his own enduring pain. He spoke of the emptiness that had followed, the silence that had become his unwanted companion. It was a confession born of shared burden, a stark revelation of his past wound that he had kept locked away for so long. Their shared vulnerability created a powerful, intimate bond. In the small circle of firelight, their hands instinctively clasped, a silent promise passing between them. The cold and darkness of the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by a beacon of human warmth. Tears traced paths down Elara's cheeks, not of despair, but of a quiet, profound release. Elias looked at her, his gaze softened, understanding that in this shared moment of brokenness, they had found an unbreakable connection. This was a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. Late in the night, the howling wind began to subside, its furious shriek gradually fading into a low moan. The cabin, which had vibrated under the blizzard's assault, now settled into a quieter creak. The dripping sounds of melting snow replaced the roar, a promise of dawn, a hint of the world re-emerging from its white shroud. Elias Thorne, his senses sharp even in sleep, stirred. The change in the storm's temperament was undeniable. He rose cautiously, moving to the door with his rifle in hand. He unbolted it slowly, a sliver of the outside world revealing itself. The snow was still deep, but the air was calmer, crisp and cold. As Elias ventured cautiously outside, his eyes scanned the landscape, taking in the vast, pristine white. But the purity was quickly broken. He found fresh tracks in the newly fallen snow, leading directly towards their cabin. They were boot prints, too numerous for one man, too heavy for passing game. A grim report passed from Elias to Elara as he re-entered the cabin. Vance's men, also weathered but relentless, had used the storm's final hours to close the distance. They were now just beyond their immediate defenses, hidden by the still deep snow and the lingering pre-dawn gloom. A silent, determined acceptance passed between them. The final confrontation was imminent. Elias rebolted the door, not for defense, but to buy them precious moments, knowing the quiet truce of the blizzard was over. The mountain had played its hand. The morning would bring the reckoning. The blizzard had broken, leaving the world softened under a fresh blanket of white. Elias Thorne moved through the snow-covered woods with silent deliberation, Elara close behind him. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and melting ice, but a different kind of chill settled on Elias's skin. He used his spyglass, scanning the distant tree line, then lowered it slowly. Vance and his men were indeed there, setting up what looked like a siege camp, their figures dark smudges against the white. Elara pointed to a faint wisp of smoke curling upwards, barely visible against the pale dawn sky. Elias nodded, confirming their assessment. Vance was not one to give up easily, especially not after being outmaneuvered by a mountain man and a young woman. Their temporary cabin, once a haven, was now a trap if they simply waited. Elias observed Vance's tactics through the spyglass, noting the careless placement of sentries, the predictable patterns of movement. He saw the impatience in Vance's men, a weakness they could exploit. Elias Thorne considered their options, knowing that direct confrontation would favor Vance's numbers. He studied the terrain, the way the snowdrifts formed natural barriers, the thawing streams now making soft, treacherous ground. The silence was heavy with anticipation, a final calm before the storm of battle that was now certain. Elias knew they needed more than just defense. They needed a plan that turned the wilderness itself into an ally, one that would catch Vance entirely off guard. Back inside the trapper's cabin, Elias Thorne outlined a bold strategy. He scratched diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick, showing Elara how the thawing landscape and residual snow could be used to their advantage. The plan involved creating confusion, splitting Vance's forces, and never engaging them in a direct, drawn-out fight. Elias explained how they would use the melting ice to create noise, the deep snow to funnel their movements, and the dense forest to conceal their own. Elara listened intently, her eyes following the lines Elias drew. She suggested a critical modification, a way to play on Vance's predictable cruelty. She recalled how Vance often left things incomplete, how he always underestimated those he thought beneath him, especially if they were women. Elara proposed using this oversight against him, planting a false trail that would lead his men not just away, but into a particularly frustrating dead end, wasting their time and resources. Elias Thorne paused, considering her words. It was a clever thought, one that spoke volumes about her understanding of their adversary. Her insight was sharp, revealing a tactical mind he had not fully anticipated. Their combined intellect and trust solidified the plan, turning it from a daring idea into a testament to their true partnership. Elias gave a slow nod of approval, a silent recognition of her invaluable contribution. The time for discussion was over. The time for action had begun. Mid-morning saw Elias Thorne and Elara moving silently through the outer perimeter of Vance's improvised camp. They used the confusing terrain in residual snow like ghosts, their moccasined feet barely disturbing the melting surface. Elias had chosen a route that kept them downwind, his senses alert to every snap of a twig, every distant cough. Their coordination was flawless, a silent dance learned through shared hardship. They began setting small, non-lethal traps and diversions. A tripwire carefully strung across a narrow game trail designed to send a cascade of pebbles down a nearby slope. A bundle of dry branches placed strategically near a thawing stream, ready to be pushed in at the right moment to create a loud splash. These were not meant to harm, but to create chaos and draw attention away from their true target. Elias Thorne knew Vance's men would quickly grow frustrated, their patience worn thin by the blizzard and the cunning of an unseen enemy. The tension was palpable, a live thing in the air. Elias and Elara narrowly avoided detection more than once, pressing themselves against snow-covered pines as a patrol passed within a few yards. Each successful maneuver, each undetected step, deepened their resolve. They were not merely surviving, they were actively fighting back. Elias could feel Elara's steady presence beside him, her quiet determination a powerful anchor in the danger. Their infiltration was complete, and the stage was set for the next phase. Chaos erupted in Vance's camp midday. A series of small traps and false alarms began to trigger, one after another, as if the very woods had come alive with mischief. A tripwire caught a careless foot, sending a man tumbling and his rifle clattering against frozen earth. A sudden loud splash from the stream drew several men rushing to investigate, only to find nothing but agitated ducks. The diversions created by Elias Thorne and Elara were taking effect, sowing confusion and disarray among Vance's men. Elias and Elara used the commotion to their advantage, moving quickly to create more distractions. A well-placed rock sent another shower of pebbles onto a lean-to, causing a startled shout. A small, controlled fire ignited under a patch of wet leaves produced a thick, acrid smoke that blew directly into the main camp, irritating eyes and lungs. These actions split Vance's forces, sending them scattering in different directions, chasing shadows and noises. Vance himself became enraged, his furious shouts echoing through the trees, further contributing to the disarray. His anger, a familiar and destructive force, began to cloud his judgment. He barked contradictory orders, his men unsure whether to pursue the unseen saboteurs or maintain their siege. Elias Thorne observed this from a hidden perch, knowing that Vance's predictable cruelty was now turning against him, making him blind to the real danger. This was a moment when a careful heart chose patience over fear, watching the enemy unravel. Vance's fury was a weapon, but it was also his greatest weakness. This wild anger would be the path to his undoing, for it made him reckless. The chaotic woods became a battlefield of wits, close to Vance's core camp in the afternoon. Elias Thorne and Elara worked as a seamless team, further dismantling Vance's forces. Elias used his intimate knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver Vance's scattered men, appearing from unexpected angles, disarming them without serious injury. He focused on speed and surprise, knocking rifles aside, sending men sprawling into snowdrifts, then vanishing back into the trees before they could regroup. Elara proved crucial, providing cover and tactical support. Her aim was steady with the small pistol Elias had given her, firing warning shots that kept Vance's men off balance. Never truly hitting, but always close enough to instill fear. Her mind was sharp, anticipating Elias's movements, covering his flanks, and drawing attention away from him at critical moments. Elias Thorne watched her, impressed by her growing skill and courage in the face of danger. They systematically reduced Vance's advantage, leaving him increasingly exposed and vulnerable. One by one, his men were either disarmed, lost in the confusion, or simply too disoriented to pose a threat. The initial shouts of rage from Vance had turned into frustrated roars as he realized his numbers were dwindling, his authority crumbling under the relentless, unseen assault. Elias felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Their teamwork was not just about survival, it was about justice. Silas Vance, now alone in a small open clearing in the late afternoon, was desperate and cornered. His face was a mask of rage, his breath pluming in the cold air. He had abandoned all strategy for brute force, his eyes darting wildly for any sign of his elusive adversaries. He saw Elara first, momentarily exposed as she moved from one cover to another. His focus narrowed, seeing her as the weaker target, the one he could exploit. Vance let out a guttural shout and made a reckless charge, a knife glinting in his hand. He lunged directly at Elara, aiming to exploit what he perceived as a weakness, a way to regain control. His intention was clear, his movement swift and brutal. Elara gasped, momentarily caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of his attack, but Elias Thorne was faster. He intercepted Vance, putting himself squarely between the enraged man and Elara. It was a clear act of selfless protection, a fundamental response born of their shared journey. Elias met Vance's charge with a firm defensive stance, his own knife drawn, ready to face the final, desperate move of a broken man. The glint of steel, the snarl of a cornered predator, and the steadfast resolve of Elias Thorne filled the clearing. The clearing became the focal point of the reckoning. Elias Thorne engaged Vance in a swift, decisive struggle, using his superior wilderness skills to disarm him. Elias moved with the fluidity of a seasoned hunter, dodging Vance's wild swings, deflecting his blade with a hard block from his forearm. He knew Vance fought with anger, but Elias fought with purpose and years of honed instinct. A quick twist, a sudden pivot, and Vance's knife flew from his grasp, embedding itself harmlessly in a snowdrift. Elara, seeing her opening, acted with precision. She had learned Vance's habits, his singular focus on what he thought he could gain. As Elias pinned Vance, Elara took a small pouch from her pocket, filled with dried, pungent herbs she had collected. She flung it with surprising force, aiming not for his face but for a nearby patch of melting snow that would splash up onto him. The concoction, meant to repel certain animals, created a sudden acrid cloud that caught Vance off guard, causing him to gag and recoil. Vance stumbled, temporarily blinded and disoriented by the unexpected assault. Elias Thorne used the moment not to injure, but to secure him. He bound Vance's hands tightly behind his back with a length of rope he always carried, then quickly secured his legs. Vance was subdued, his reign of terror over, defeated not by brute force alone, but by ingenuity, teamwork, and the clever use of the land's own remedies. The struggle ended with a final, defiant grunt from Vance, followed by Elias's triumphant exhale. Elara stood firm with her pistol ready, a testament to her unwavering courage. Elias and Elara had turned the predator's own nature against him. This was not merely a victory of strength, but a triumph of wisdom. As dust settled over the clearing, a quiet victory descended upon Elias Thorne and Elara. Vance and his remaining men, found scattered and disoriented, were tied up, disarmed, and left in a secure but visible location for the authorities to find. Elias and Elara sat side by side on a fallen log, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a deep, weary sense of peace. The immediate threat was gone, the air now calm and still. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared glance that spoke volumes. They had survived together against overwhelming odds. The wilderness, their home, was safe for now. Elias felt a profound relief, a lightness in his spirit he had not known since his own loss. Elara leaned her head against his shoulder, a soft sigh escaping her lips. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the snow. Their tired but smiling faces reflected the golden light. Elias knew that a new future felt possible, not just for him, but for them both, built on the solid ground of shared courage and unwavering trust. The cabin, once a simple refuge, now awaited them as a true home. Elias Thorne felt the crunch of melting snow under his boots as they rode. The path back to his original cabin was familiar, a ribbon winding through the awakening forest. But now it felt different, imbued with a quiet promise. Sunlight filtered through the budding branches, painting patches of warmth on the ground. Elara rode beside him, her gaze scanning the landscape, no longer with fear, but with a burgeoning sense of belonging. She spoke softly of the spring growth, of the new green shoots pushing through the thawing earth. She saw the cabin ahead, a wisp of smoke already rising from its stone chimney, and called it a home. Elias felt a lightness in his chest he had not known in years, a quiet lifting of the heavy cloak of solitude. He looked at his land with fresh eyes, seeing not just a refuge he defended, but a future he could build. The air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a welcome, familiar smell. He felt the weight of his compass against his chest, a constant reminder of direction, but now the path felt clearer than any needle could show. He had found his way back, not just to a place, but to a purpose. Over the following weeks, Elias Thorne and Elara worked tirelessly. The cabin, fences, and barn had suffered from winter's grip and Vance's destructive touch. Elias moved with a renewed vigor, his hands skilled with hammer and saw, repairing broken posts and patching the roof. Elara proved a skilled and enthusiastic helper, her energy a bright spark in the quiet homestead. She hauled stones for a new foundation, learned to mix mortar, and even took to planing rough-cut boards with surprising grace. Her laughter, once rare and hesitant, now echoed through the valley as they worked together. The homestead slowly transformed, each mended plank and straightened fence post, a physical manifestation of their growing partnership. Elias found himself humming old tunes as he worked, something he had not done since long ago. The land, once merely a place to endure, now felt like fertile ground for shared dreams. Elias knew that every swing of the hammer, every nail driven, was a commitment to this new life they were forging. Evening settled gently upon the valley, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Inside the cabin, Elara sat by the fire, her hands busy with a small piece of pine. She carved a miniature deer, its delicate legs poised as if to leap, her movements now confident and peaceful. Elias watched her from across the room, cleaning his rifle, his gaze soft. He saw how the fear no longer gripped her as it once had, replaced by a deep sense of security. She had found a quiet strength, a resilience forged in hardship. Elias knew his protective role had borne fruit, not just in keeping her safe from external threats, but in allowing her spirit to mend. The rhythmic scrape of her carving tool was a soothing sound, a testament to the quiet domesticity they had built together. The fire cast a warm glow on her face, illuminating a newfound peace that filled the small cabin. The next day, Elias Thorne and Elara sat by the river, fishing rods dipped in the cool, clear water. The sun dappled through the overhead leaves, warming their faces. Elias, feeling a profound sense of safety and acceptance, spoke openly about the loss of his family, the wife and child taken by a sudden illness years ago. He told Elara of the crushing guilt he had carried, the feeling that he should have been there, that he had somehow failed them. Elara listened without judgment, her eyes fixed on the flowing water, understanding in her quiet gaze. She reached out, her gentle hand resting on his arm, a silent comfort. She spoke then, not of her own past, but of the way the mountains could be both giver and taker, of the swift and cruel turns life often took in the wilderness. She spoke of how even the strongest could not outrun fate, and how often the blame one carried was not a burden of their own making. This was a moment when a careful heart chose patience over fear. The confession unburdened Elias, allowing him to truly let go of his past and embrace the present. He finally understood that the relentless self-blame had been another form of running, and now, standing still with Elara, he felt truly free. He had always believed his grief was his alone, a private punishment. Elara's shared wisdom offered a different perspective, suggesting that many in this wild land knew such harsh, unpreventable losses, and that his suffering had been an echo of a common human experience, not a singular failing. Later that evening, on the porch of the cabin, Elias Thorne and Elara sat together, watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of orange and purple. They spoke of their hopes and dreams for a life together, a life no longer overshadowed by fear or lingering sorrow. Elias, no longer bound by his past, proposed that they build a life on this land, together, not just a refuge but a true home. Elara accepted, her eyes shining with hope, embracing the idea of a family and a home she had thought lost forever. The golden light of the fading day seemed to bless their joined hands, their happy smiles reflecting the peace that had settled between them. The wilderness that had once held Elias captive in his grief now held the promise of a future, vast and unwritten, yet full of shared possibility. A few days later, Elias Thorne and Elara made their first cautious contact with a nearby settlement. They traveled to a small, isolated trading post to acquire supplies, a careful step back into the wider world. Curious glances followed them, but the local merchant, a kindly old man with a weathered face, offered them a polite welcome. He spoke of the spring melt and the prospect of a good season, his voice steady and calm. Elias responded with quiet courtesy, purchasing the goods they needed. Elara remained observant, her initial wariness slowly giving way to a hopeful curiosity. The interaction is brief but positive, a small sign that they might find acceptance beyond their secluded valley. They returned to the cabin with not just supplies, but a glimmer of connection to the human world. Returning to the trading post later in the day, Elias Thorne and Elara found a warmer reception. Word of Elias's handling of Silas Vance had spread, earning him quiet respect from some of the independent settlers who frequented the post. A few neighbors, impressed by their resilience and the calm strength they exuded, offered small gestures of friendship and help, speaking of shared work for the coming harvest. Elias, though still reserved, accepted their overtures with a humble nod, sensing a genuine warmth. Elara, no longer hiding in the shadows, exchanged smiles with the other women, finding common ground in the shared struggles of frontier life. They felt a growing sense of cautious belonging, no longer entirely isolated in the vast wilderness. The cabin, once a solitary bastion, now felt less alone, connected by invisible threads to this nascent community. That evening inside the cabin, Elias Thorne held his carved wooden compass. Its familiar weight was a comfort in his palm, the iron needle still pointing true north. He realized it no longer just pointed north, or even towards a moral path, but directly to Elara, to their home, to the life they were building. The compass, once a symbol of his solitary wanderings and his desperate search for meaning, was now a symbol of connection. It was a guide to his true home, not a physical place on a map, but the shared life he found with Elara. The warmth of the cabin, the soft glow of the fire, and the quiet presence of Elara filled him with a profound sense of peace. The compass had guided him through the wilderness, and now, its journey complete, it pointed him towards a future rooted in love. Months later, the mountain spring arrived with a gentle warmth, painting Elias's valley in shades of green. The homestead itself flourished, a living testament to shared effort and unwavering hope. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, now stood warm and welcoming, its windows gleaming with new glass. Outside, the garden Elara tended overflowed with young sprouts and blossoming flowers, promising rich harvests. New structures, a sturdy woodshed, and an expanded chicken coop stood proudly, their fresh timber smelling of pine and possibility. Elias and Elara moved through their days in an easy rhythm, their movements synchronized, their presence a comfortable counterpoint to the wilderness around them. He repaired the last of the winter's damage, mending fences and patching the barn roof, while she crafted new shelves inside and stitched colorful quilts. Their home pulsed with life and activity, a vibrant hub of purpose. The land, once a desolate expanse that mirrored Elias's grief, now felt tamed by their love and effort, thriving under their dedicated care. He often found himself smiling, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes, a feeling he had almost forgotten. As summer deepened, Elara began to venture beyond the homestead, carrying their story to the small, scattered community. At the trading post, during a gathering of local settlers, she shared her skills for mending and preserving, her quiet strength drawing the attention of other women. Her stories, told with a newfound confidence, spoke of resilience in the deep wisdom of the mountains, earning her respect. Soon Elara began to organize a small schoolhouse in an unused shed near the trading post, teaching the children to read and write, her patience and kindness a steady light. She became a respected figure, a bridge between the isolated homesteads and the burgeoning community. Her efforts slowly, beautifully, wove Elias and herself firmly into the fabric of this nascent society, proving they were no longer just isolated figures surviving alone. The wild, untamed land now cradled a growing sense of belonging for them both. Late that summer, a new settler arrived in the valley, a young man named Thomas, fresh from the plains with a hopeful but uncertain gaze. He sought Elias Thorne at his homestead, drawn by the stories of the mountain man who had faced down Silas Vance and built a thriving home in the wilderness. Elias listened patiently as Thomas spoke of his dreams and his fears about the unfamiliar terrain. Elias, once a solitary figure who sought only his own peace, now offered his hard-earned wisdom with a quiet generosity. He pointed out the best places to find water, shared tips for building a durable cabin, and spoke of reading the signs of the forest. Elias's reputation as a fair and knowledgeable man grew with each passing day, his words carrying the weight of experience. He was no longer just a mountain man, hidden from the world, but a silent guardian and mentor for those building lives around him, his solitude transforming into a quiet strength for others. Elias realized his path had shifted, from self-preservation to community building. This was a new kind of north for his compass. Autumn arrived, painting the mountains in fiery hues, and the homestead hosted a lively harvest feast. Long tables, fashioned from rough-hewn planks, groaned under the weight of abundant food harvested from their flourishing garden and the surrounding woods. Laughter and music filled the crisp air, mingling with the scent of roasting game and fresh baked bread. Children played among the hay bales, their joyful shouts echoing through the valley. Elias and Elara stood together, welcoming everyone who arrived, their faces radiating a deep, settled happiness and a profound sense of belonging. It was a powerful testament to how far they had come, not just surviving the wilderness, but building a life and a family in its very heart. Their embrace in the warm glow of lanterns spoke of a future firmly planted. Later that night, after the last of the guests had departed and the last lantern was extinguished, Elias and Elara sat on their cabin porch. They gazed up at the vast, star-strewn sky, their hands clasped tightly together. The silence of the wilderness, once a companion to Elias's loneliness, now felt like a comforting blanket. They reflected on their arduous journey, the dangers faced, the harsh winter, and the enduring love that had brought them through it all. The vast wilderness that had once felt isolating, a formidable adversary, now felt like a nurturing home, a testament to their enduring spirit and shared purpose. Their quiet appreciation for this hard-won peace was a powerful thing. Early the next morning, as spring truly reasserted its gentle dominance, Elias and Elara walked hand in hand down the path towards their flourishing garden. The small iron-bound wooden compass, once a lifeline in Elias's solitary wanderings, now hung close to his heart, a symbol of their shared journey. The morning sun warmed their faces, illuminating fresh tracks of deer and rabbit crossing their path, signs of new life stirring all around them. The world was still wild and full of unseen paths, but they faced it together, their love a steadfast compass for their future. A distant, gentle wolf howl echoed through the valley, a reminder that the wild still lived, but so did they, intertwined with its pulse. Tonight the house remembered how to breathe, full of a quiet, settled joy. Their shared life was not where his old path ended, but where a new one had truly begun.